The last emperor of the Ming Dynasty did not die on a battlefield. He did not fall beneath the banners of a foreign army. He did not vanish into legend aboard a secret ship. He died alone outside the palace his ancestors had built to command the world. In the spring of 1644, Beijing was breaking. The great capital of the Ming Empire, the city of vermilion walls, imperial gates, ritual courtyards, and forbidden chambers, was no longer a symbol of eternal order. It was a trap. Rebel forces were closing in. Officials who had once bowed before the throne now searched for ways to survive the fall. Soldiers deserted. Servants whispered. The machinery of empire, built over nearly 3 centuries, was coming apart in a matter of days. At the center of it all stood the Zhongzhen emperor. He was not the founder. He was not the conqueror. He was not the emperor who built the forbidden city. He was the heir to everything the Zhu family had created: the throne, the rituals, the armies, the tax system, the ancestral memory, and the impossible burden of saving a dynasty already rotting from within. When the rebels entered Beijing, the emperor's world collapsed into silence. The Son of Heaven, the man whose authority was supposed to link Earth to the cosmos, could not command his generals. He could not protect his capital. He could not save his household. And finally, he could not save himself. According to the traditional account, he fled toward Coal Hill, just north of the Forbidden City. There, beneath a tree, he hanged himself. It was a death heavy with symbolism. Behind him stood the palace of emperors. Before him stood a new age of conquest. Around him lay the ruins of a family that had once risen from hunger, rebellion, and vengeance to rule the largest empire on earth. The Ming Dynasty had promised restoration. It ended in abandonment. But to understand why this death mattered, we have to enter the palace he failed to save. The palace did not fall with him. Long after the last Ming emperor drew his final breath, the Forbidden City remained silent, intact, and waiting for its next master. Its gates did not crumble. Its halls did not burn. The empire collapsed, but the architecture of its power endured. Rising at the heart of Beijing, the Forbidden City was never just a residence. It was a statement, a carefully constructed universe designed to make one idea undeniable, that the emperor stood at the center of all things. Every wall, every courtyard, every golden roof tile served a purpose. The city was aligned along a strict north-south axis, a physical expression of cosmic order. At its southern gates, officials would enter and bow, submitting themselves to ritual and hierarchy. At its northern end, hidden deep within layers of guarded halls, lived the imperial family, isolated, protected, and imprisoned by the same system that elevated them. To the outside world, the palace represented perfection, balance, authority, eternal stability, but inside it told a different story. Access was everything. Distance from the emperor meant distance from power. Ministers could spend their entire careers waiting for a single audience. Eunuchs, stripped of family and future, gained influence not through rank but proximity. Women of the inner court lived in luxury that felt indistinguishable from confinement. Even princes born into privilege grew up surrounded by suspicion, watched by a system that feared betrayal as much as it feared invasion. The Forbidden City was not just a palace, it was a machine designed to control movement, information, loyalty, and perceptions. A machine that turned family into institution, and institution into something larger than any individual ruler. It made emperors appear eternal, even when they were anything but, and that is why it survived. When the Ming fell, the palace did not lose its meaning. It simply changed hands. New rulers would walk its halls, perform its rituals, and claim its symbolism. The structure outlived the bloodline that built it, as if the idea of empire mattered more than the family that once controlled it. But this raises a deeper question. If the palace could survive without the Ming, then what, exactly, had the Zhu family truly built? Because the more permanent their creation appeared, the more fragile their power had been. And to understand how that contradiction began, we have to return to the moment when the Ming family first rose, not in marble halls, but in a world defined by hunger, chaos, and collapse. This is not just the story of an empire. It is the story of a family that rose from nothing, and built something so powerful, so controlled, and so carefully designed that it reshaped China for centuries. Even after it collapsed, the Ming Dynasty did not begin with inherited wealth. ancient titles, or divine privilege. It began with hunger, with a boy who had no land, no army, no name that mattered. And yet, within a single lifetime, that same bloodline would claim the mandate of heaven, overthrow a foreign empire, and construct one of the most sophisticated systems of rule the world had ever seen. But power like that is never simple, because the Ming did not just restore China. They redefined it. They centralized authority, rebuilt institutions, reshaped the economy, and projected their influence across land and sea. They created beauty, porcelain, literature, architecture that still defines cultural memory today. And at the center of it all stood the Forbidden City, a place designed to make power feel eternal. But beneath that surface, something darker was always present. Fear, fear of rebellion, fear of betrayal, fear of losing what had been taken through violence in the first place. The same dynasty that promised order would rely on surveillance, purges, and control to maintain it. The same family that rose from suffering would create systems that produced it. So the questions begin to emerge. How did a peasant become an emperor? How did a family turn survival into absolute rule? Who benefited from that power, and who paid the price? What parts of the Ming story are grounded in history, and what parts have become myth? And perhaps most importantly, why does this dynasty still matter today? Because the Ming did not simply disappear in 1644. Their ideas survived. Their symbols survived. Their architecture survived. Their vision of power, controlled, centralized, and carefully staged, echoes far beyond their own time. And to understand why people still look back at the Ming with fascination, admiration, and suspicion, we have to go back to the beginning, to a China that was already falling apart, before the Zhu family ever touched power. Before the Ming could rise, China had to break. By the middle of the 14th century, the empire ruled by the Mongol Yuan dynasty was no longer the terrifying force that had once conquered kingdoms across Asia. Its armies still carried the memory of conquest. Its court still claimed the right to rule all under heaven. But beneath the surface, the system was weakening. For many Chinese subjects, Yuan rule carried a wound that never fully healed. The Mongols had conquered the Song, taken the throne, and placed China inside a vast imperial order ruled by outsiders. The Yuan emperors adopted parts of Chinese government, but they never erased the sense that power had been seized by a foreign dynasty. Ethnic hierarchy, political exclusion, heavy taxation, and corruption deepened resentment. To many, the empire did not feel like a restored order. It felt like occupation wearing the robes of legitimacy. And then nature turned against the state. Floods devastated the Yellow River region. Harvests failed. Famine spread. Disease followed hunger. The government demanded taxes from people who could barely feed themselves. Officials squeezed villages for grain, labor, and money, while the court struggled with debt, factionalism, and military weakness. The mandate of heaven was not just a religious idea, it was a political judgment. When floods came, when famine spread, when rebellion multiplied, people began to ask whether heaven had withdrawn its favor from the ruling house. This was the world into which the Zhu family was born. Not a world of privilege, not a world of palace education or inherited influence. A world of mud, hunger, plague, debt, and fear. The kind of world where ordinary families vanished without leaving records. The kind of world where survival itself became a form of ambition. But collapse does not affect everyone equally. For the powerful, crisis can be an inconvenience. For the poor, it is annihilation. And for one child born into a family with almost nothing, the failure of the Yuan would not be an abstract historical turning point. It would become personal. Because before Zhu Yuanzhang became the founder of the Ming Dynasty, before he claimed the mandate of heaven, before his descendants ruled from behind the walls of the Forbidden City, he was simply a starving boy in a dying empire. And the empire's collapse was about to take everything from him. The empire did not collapse all at once. For most people, it disappeared slowly, one harvest at a time. Zhu Yuanzhang was born into a world where survival was uncertain even in good years. His family were peasants, bound to the land, dependent on the rhythm of seasons they could not control, and a government that demanded more than it protected. They owned little. They possessed no titles, no connections, no shield against disaster. When the system worked, they endured. When it failed, they had nowhere to fall. And then it failed. Floods disrupted the land. Crops failed. Hunger spread across entire regions. The same state that should have stabilized the crisis instead deepened it. Tax demands continued, obligations remained, and the gap between imperial authority and local suffering widened into something dangerous. For Zhu, this was not history, it was loss. His parents died within a short span, along with siblings victims of famine and disease that moved through the countryside without resistance. There was no safety net, no extended structure strong enough to absorb the shock. Death did not arrive as a single tragedy. It arrived in waves until the family itself ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. What remained was a boy with nothing. No inheritance, no land, no protection, no place in the system that claimed to rule over him. In a different world, his story might have ended there. Another life erased by forces too large to resist. But collapse creates space as well as destruction, and in that space, the rules begin to change. Zhu did what survival demanded. He begged, he moved, he adapted. Hunger became constant, not an event, but a condition. He learned quickly that order was fragile, that authority could fail, and that those at the bottom were the first to be abandoned. These lessons would not fade. They would become the foundation of how he understood power itself. Eventually, he found temporary refuge in a Buddhist monastery. It was not a spiritual calling. It was survival dressed as religion. Monasteries, even in times of crisis, could offer food, shelter, and a structured life, something the outside world could no longer guarantee. For a time, Zhu exchanged wandering for ritual, hunger for discipline. He became a novice monk, part of an institution that existed alongside the state, but not entirely within its control. But even this refuge was fragile. As famine deepened, monasteries lost their ability to sustain those who depended on them. Resources dwindled, stability vanished again. Zhu was forced back onto the road, no longer even protected by the thin safety of religious life. He became what the collapsing empire produced in increasing numbers, a drifter, a survivor, a man moving through a landscape where authority had weakened and opportunity, however dangerous, was beginning to emerge. And in that environment, something began to shift. The same conditions that destroyed his family were beginning to produce something else: rebellion. Across the countryside, movements were forming, religious, political, desperate. They promised justice, salvation, revenge. They attracted the dispossessed, the angry, the ambitious. To some, they were chaos. To others, they were the only path forward. Zhu Yuanzhang was no longer just surviving. He was approaching the moment where survival could turn into power, and that transformation would begin not with inheritance, but with a choice to step into a rebellion that was already reshaping the fate of China. The road taught Zhu Yuanzhang what the monastery could not. Inside the temple, there had been rhythm, chants, rituals, duties, silence. Even hunger had been organized. But outside, in the ruined countryside of the late Yuan Empire, there was no order left to trust. Zhu moved through a world where villages had been emptied by famine, where fields lay neglected, where tax collectors still demanded obedience from people who had almost nothing left to give. He saw what imperial collapse looked like from below, not as policy failure, not as court intrigue, but as bodies on roads, abandoned homes, broken families, and men willing to follow anyone who promised food, justice, or revenge. This was the education of the future emperor. He learned how people spoke when they were afraid. He learned which officials were hated. He learned how quickly loyalty could disappear when hunger entered the room. He learned that law without protection was only another form of violence. And somewhere on that road, the orphaned monk began to harden. He had already lost the illusions that protected ordinary men. He knew family could vanish. He knew temples could fail. He knew rulers could demand loyalty while offering nothing in return. What he did not yet know was how to command. That lesson came through rebellion. The Red Turban movement was spreading through the wounds of the Yuan dynasty. It was not a neat army with a single vision. It was a volatile mixture of religious belief, anti-Mongol resentment, peasant anger, local ambition, and apocalyptic hope. Its followers spoke of renewal. Some believed in the coming of the Maitreya Buddha. Others wanted land, revenge, or liberation from a dynasty they saw as foreign and corrupt. To the Yuan court, they were rebels. To the desperate, they were possibility. Zhu joined them not as a prince, not as a scholar, not as a man of noble blood, but as someone shaped by the very suffering the rebellion claimed to answer. He entered the movement with no inherited authority. Whatever power he gained would have to be earned, taken, or manufactured. At first, he was one man among many. But rebellion is a brutal school. It rewards courage, adaptability, suspicion, and the ability to read other men before they read you. Zhu proved useful. He could endure hardship. He could follow discipline. He could win trust. More importantly, he could learn. He began to understand that violence alone was not enough. Bandits could burn towns. Rebels could win battles. But rulers needed something more. They needed grain, records, alliances, legitimacy. Men who could fight and men who could write. They needed to convince people that their power was not merely stronger, but rightful. This was where Zhu began to separate himself from the chaos around him. The beggar had learned suffering. The monk had learned discipline. The rebel would learn command. And slowly, almost impossibly, a man who had once owned nothing began moving toward the one thing no one would have imagined for him: the throne. But rebellion would only open the door. To walk through it, Zhu Yuanzhang would have to master the crisis that was consuming the Yuan dynasty, and turn a movement of anger into the foundation of a new imperial family. Rebellion gave Zhu Yuanzhang a weapon, but chaos gave him a kingdom. The Red Turban Uprising did not begin as the story of one man. It began as a symptom of a dying dynasty. Across the Yuan Empire, anger moved faster than imperial orders. Peasants, religious sects, smugglers, soldiers, and local strongmen gathered around a shared conviction: the world had fallen out of balance, and the rulers in the north no longer deserved obedience. This was more than hunger turning into violence. It was a crisis of belief. The Yuan court still claimed legitimacy, but legitimacy means little when fields are flooded, taxes are unbearable, officials are despised, and families are starving. The imperial center could issue commands, but in the countryside, power was becoming local, armed, and unstable. For men like Zhu, this was dangerous, but it was also the first real opening he had ever seen. Under normal conditions, a peasant orphan could not rise into the ruling class. He could not inherit command. He could not enter the highest ranks of government. The empire had its hierarchies, and he had been born beneath them. But rebellion breaks old doors. The Red Turban movement created a world where courage, brutality, loyalty, and timing could matter more than birth. The collapse of Yuan authority allowed unknown men to become commanders. It allowed followers to gather around charisma instead of rank. It allowed violence to become political currency. Yet Zhu's opportunity was not simply that the Yuan was weak. Many men saw weakness. Many men raised banners. Most disappeared. Zhu's advantage was that he understood suffering from the inside, but he did not remain trapped inside it. He knew what desperate people wanted. He knew why they hated officials. He knew how hunger could make men reckless, but also how order could make them loyal. He had lived as the kind of person rebellion claimed to defend. That gave him credibility. But credibility alone did not build dynasties. The Red Turban world was full of rivals. Some were true believers. Some were warlords wearing religious language as armor. Some wanted justice. Others wanted plunder. The movement that challenged the Yuan also threatened to consume itself. This was the crisis inside the opportunity. Zhu had to rise without being destroyed by the chaos that lifted him. He had to use rebellion without becoming only a rebel. He had to fight the Yuan while also outlasting men who were supposedly on his side. And this is where his story changes, because Zhu Yuanzhang began to see what others missed. The future would not belong to the loudest revolutionary. It would belong to the man who could turn rebellion into government. Many could promise vengeance. Zhu would learn to promise order, and that difference would make him more dangerous than the armies he first joined. Zhu Yuanzhang did not conquer China by being the most violent man in the rebellion. He conquered it by becoming the most useful. In the shattered world of the late Yuan, violence was everywhere. Armies rose and vanished. Commanders declared visions of salvation, then fought over cities, grain, and titles. Men who called themselves liberators could become predators the moment they gained power. To ordinary people, the difference between a rebel army and a bandit force could disappear overnight. Zhu understood this danger. He had lived among the people these armies claimed to defend. He knew that hunger could make people welcome a rebel force one day and fear it the next. He knew that peasants did not only want vengeance against the Yuan, they wanted fields protected, families spared, taxes made predictable, roads secured. They wanted the simple miracle of order. So Zhu began to shape himself into something more than a fighter. He became disciplined, careful, strategic. He learned to reward loyalty and punish betrayal. He understood that an army that could not feed itself would eventually turn against the population, and that a commander who allowed uncontrolled plunder would destroy his own future tax base before he ever became a ruler. This was not softness. It was calculation. Where other rebel leaders burned through support, Zhu tried to preserve it. He took cities, but he also needed administrators. He needed records. He needed men who understood grain, taxation, ritual, and law. So he began drawing scholars and officials into his orbit, men who could give his rebellion the language of legitimacy. This was one of his most important transformations. The orphan had learned survival. The monk had learned discipline. The rebel commander was now learning the grammar of empire. He married into power. He built alliances. He absorbed rivals when useful and eliminated them when necessary. He watched the weaknesses of other commanders and turned their failures into lessons. He understood that charisma could win followers, but institutions could hold territory. And slowly, Zhu became harder to dismiss. He was not born to rule, but he learned how rulers behaved. He understood symbolism, he understood timing. He understood that if he wanted to replace the Yuan, he could not look like another temporary rebel. He had to look like the answer to disorder itself. That meant restraint when restraint was useful. It meant brutality when brutality served the future. This is the moral tension at the center of Zhu Yuanzhang's rise. His suffering made him credible, but it did not make him gentle. His poverty gave him insight into the lives of ordinary people, but it also produced a ruler who would later distrust elites, ministers, generals, and even his own servants with ferocious intensity. The same qualities that helped him survive would help him rule. And the same qualities that helped him rule would eventually make his empire terrifying. By the time Zhu emerged as one of the strongest rebel leaders in China, he had already crossed a threshold. He was no longer just fighting the Yuan. He was preparing to replace them. His army was becoming a state before it had a throne. His court was forming before he had an empire. His family, once nearly erased by famine, was moving toward a destiny no one could have predicted. But there was one final transformation still ahead. Zhu Yuanzhang had learned how to command men. Now he had to persuade heaven, history, and China itself that he had the right to command everyone. Victory did not come in a single moment. It came in stages, city by city, rival by rival, until one man stood where many had fallen. By the late 1360s, the Yuan dynasty was no longer an empire in control. It was an empire in retreat. Its authority had fractured, its armies were stretched, and its legitimacy had been hollowed out by years of crisis. Rebel forces had carved the country into competing zones of power, each claiming the future, each fighting for survival. But Zhu Yuanzhang was no longer one of many contenders. He was becoming the final one. His forces moved with increasing discipline. Where others hesitated or fractured, Zhu consolidated. He took Nanjing not just as a military prize, but as a political center. From there, he began to shape something that looked less like a rebellion and more like a government waiting to declare itself. This was the critical shift. Many men had rebelled against the Yuan. Zhu began to act as if the Yuan were already gone. He issued orders not as a challenger, but as a ruler in formation. He organized administration. He gathered scholars who could frame his authority in the language of tradition and legitimacy. He did not just fight for territory. He began to define the meaning of power itself. And then, in 1368, he made the decision that changed everything. Zhu Yuanzhang declared the founding of a new dynasty. He named it Ming, brightness. It was not an accidental choice. After decades of war, famine, and foreign rule, the word carried weight. It suggested clarity after darkness, order after chaos, restoration after humiliation. It told the people of China that this was not merely a new regime, it was a return to something they believed had been lost. Zhu did not present himself as a conqueror. He presented himself as a restorer. This was how he claimed the mandate of heaven, not through divine revelation, but through narrative. The Yuan had failed. The signs were visible in famine, rebellion, and disorder. Heaven had withdrawn its favor. Zhu, through victory and stability, would restore balance. His rise was not framed as ambition, it was framed as necessity. This was political genius, because legitimacy, once accepted, is more powerful than force. The Yuan court fled north. The capital fell. And for the first time in nearly a century, China was again ruled by a native dynasty. Zhu Yuanzhang took the title of Hongwu Emperor, and with it the full weight of imperial authority. But this was not simply the end of one empire and the beginning of another. It was the transformation of a man shaped by hunger into the center of absolute power. And that transformation carried consequences, because the emperor who had risen from nothing did not forget what nothing felt like. He did not forget how quickly systems could collapse. He did not forget how powerless ordinary people were when authority failed. So he resolved to build something that would never fail again. An empire of order, an empire of control, an empire where chaos would be crushed before it could take shape. But the deeper his desire for stability became, the more dangerous his methods would be. And this is where the Ming story begins to darken. Because the dynasty that promised brightness was about to build a system defined as much by fear as by order. The first Ming emperor did not want to build a court of luxury. He wanted to build a world that could not collapse the way his world had collapsed. To understand Hongwu's rule, we have to remember what he had survived. He had watched famine destroy families. He had seen officials demand obedience from people they failed to protect. He had lived through a dynasty that lost the confidence of the countryside long before it lost its capital. So when he became emperor, his dream was not merely conquest. It was prevention. Hongwu imagined an empire rooted in the land. Farmers would farm, soldiers would serve, officials would obey, families would remain registered, taxed, disciplined, and visible. Society would be organized into clear roles, each person tied to duty, each village tied to responsibility, each official tied to punishment if he abused power. In his mind, this was not tyranny. It was moral repair. The empire had been broken by greed, disorder, corruption, and foreign domination. Hongwu believed the cure was simplicity, discipline, agriculture, and obedience. He distrusted excessive commerce. He disliked luxury. He saw corrupt officials as parasites feeding on the people. He wanted a state that protected the common farmer from the predatory official and protected the dynasty from the chaos of the ambitious. There was something almost righteous in this vision. A peasant emperor, scarred by poverty, trying to make sure no future empire ignored the suffering of the countryside. But righteousness can become dangerous when combined with absolute power. Hongwu's dream had no room for uncertainty, no room for independent centers of influence, no room for ministers who became too powerful, generals who became too popular, or officials who interpreted loyalty differently from the throne. The same memories that made him hate corruption also made him fear betrayal. The same suffering that made him value order also made him ruthless toward disorder. He had risen from the bottom of the world, and now he intended to control that world from the top. The Ming Dynasty would present itself as restoration. But under Hongwu, restoration would mean registration, surveillance, punishment, and obedience. The founder had built an empire from chaos. Now, he would try to make chaos impossible. Order in Hongwu's empire was not a philosophy. It was a system you could measure, record, and enforce. The new emperor did not trust vague loyalty or inherited privilege. He wanted a state that could see its people, count them, control them, and hold them in place. The memory of collapse was still too fresh. If the Yuan had fallen because they lost control of the countryside, Then the Ming would survive by tightening its grip on it. So the empire became legible. Households were registered. Families were grouped into units responsible for each other's behavior. Names, ages, occupations, landholdings, everything was recorded. Movement was restricted. A man was not simply free to disappear into another province or reinvent himself. He belonged somewhere, and the state intended to know where. This was not only administration, it was surveillance. Land was reorganized to support stability. The ideal was simple: farmers tied to fields, producing grain, paying taxes, sustaining the dynasty. Hongwu distrusted merchants and large accumulations of private wealth. To him, commerce represented instability, shifting loyalties, and the kind of inequality that could tear society apart. Agriculture, by contrast, meant rootedness, predictability, control. So the empire favored the plow over the market. Taxes were structured to extract grain and labor. Military households were assigned hereditary service. Communities were expected to police themselves. Order was not just imposed from above, it was embedded into daily life, into the structure of the village, into the expectations placed on every family. And above all of it stood the law. The Ming legal code was detailed, severe, and unapologetically punitive. It defined crime, punishment, hierarchy, and obligation with precision. But law under Hongwu was not only about justice, it was about deterrence. It was about making the cost of disorder so high that rebellion would never again seem like an option. This is where the contrast becomes clear. To some, this system offered protection. Predictable taxes could be better than arbitrary extraction. Strong enforcement could shield villagers from bandits and corrupt local elites. A visible state could mean a functioning state, but to others it felt like suffocation. The same records that provided order also removed freedom. The same laws that promised justice also delivered harsh punishments. The same structure that protected the weak also ensured they could never easily rise beyond their assigned place. Hongwu was not building a flexible empire. He was building a controlled one. Every reform carried the imprint of his past. Every policy reflected his belief that if people were left unchecked, the world would fall back into chaos. Trust was limited. Authority was centralized. Power flowed upward toward the throne, and rarely downward in any meaningful sense. And for a time, it worked. The countryside stabilized. Production recovered. The Ming state became one of the most organized regimes in the world. From the outside, it began to look like the very thing Hongwu had promised, a restored, disciplined, morally grounded empire. But there was a cost hidden inside that stability, because when a system depends on control, it also depends on fear. And the more Hongwu built his empire around order, the more he began to see threats everywhere, especially among the very officials he relied on to run it. Which is why the next phase of his rule would not be about building the state, it would be about purging it. The emperor who hated corruption began to see conspiracy everywhere. At first, Hongwu's suspicion had a logic. He had not been born inside the world of officials. He had risen against it. To him, the educated elite were not simply servants of the state. They were a class with their own language, networks, arrogance, and hidden loyalties. They could write the laws. They could interpret the records. They could surround the emperor with obedience while quietly protecting themselves. Hongwu needed them, and he did not trust them. This was the central contradiction of his rule. The Ming Empire required scholars, ministers, magistrates, clerks, and military commanders to function. But every powerful servant looked to Hongwu like a possible rival. Every administrative mistake could be read as sabotage. Every alliance among officials could look like the beginning of a faction. Every ambitious minister carried the shadow of treason. The result was fear at the heart of government. One of the most infamous episodes came with the case of Hu Weiyong, the powerful chief minister accused of plotting against the throne. Whether every accusation was true, exaggerated, or politically useful, the result was unmistakable. Hongwu used the crisis to destroy the office of chief minister itself. No single official would ever again stand between the emperor and the machinery of state. It was a decisive act of centralization. It was also a warning. Thousands were implicated in political purges during Hongwu's reign. Families were ruined. Officials were executed. Networks were shattered. The punishments did not merely remove enemies, they created an atmosphere in which survival depended on absolute caution. Service to the emperor became both the highest honor and one of the most dangerous positions in the empire. This is where Hongwu's restoration darkened into terror. He had promised to defend the people from corrupt power, but now power had gathered so completely in his own hands that there was little protection from the emperor himself. The man who knew what it meant to be crushed by an unjust system had built a system where one man's suspicion could destroy entire households. Yet from Hongwu's perspective, this was not madness. It was prevention. He had watched the Yuan dynasty decay through corruption, faction, and arrogance. He believed ministers could hollow out a state from within. He believed powerful men, if left unchecked, would betray the throne just as surely as rebels would attack it from outside. And because he had seized power through rebellion himself, he understood better than anyone that empires could be overthrown. That knowledge made him dangerous. The founder's genius was inseparable from his fear. His memory of collapse gave him discipline, but also paranoia. His hatred of elite corruption gave him moral force, but also cruelty. He built institutions that strengthened the dynasty, then weakened those same institutions by making everyone inside them afraid. The Ming state would inherit this contradiction. It would be powerful, disciplined, and deeply centralized, but it would also be haunted by the founder's suspicion. Later emperors would rule inside a system where authority flowed directly to the throne, where officials feared imperial anger, and where private access to the emperor could become more powerful than public office. Hongwu had saved the empire from chaos, but he had also taught it to fear itself, and once fear entered the bloodline of Ming rule, it did not leave. Because Hongwu's next problem was even more dangerous than corrupt ministers or defeated rebels. He had to make sure his own family could inherit the empire without destroying it. An empire can be conquered in a lifetime, but keeping it inside a family, that is the harder task. Hongwu had built the Ming dynasty through war, discipline, and fear. He had centralized authority, broken the power of rival officials, and placed himself at the absolute center of the state. But as his reign progressed, a new problem began to dominate his thinking. What happens when the founder is gone? Because history had already shown him the answer. Dynasties do not collapse when they are strongest. They collapse when succession weakens them, when heirs are inexperienced, when ministers compete for influence, when generals sense opportunity, and when members of the ruling family themselves become threats. Hongwu had seen it in the Yuan. He had used it to rise, and now he had to prevent it from happening to his own bloodline. His solution was not trust, it was structure. Hongwu created a system in which his sons would serve as pillars of the dynasty. Princes of the imperial family were granted territories across the empire, particularly along strategic frontiers. They were given titles, military authority, and regional influence. On the surface, it looked like a protective network, loyal members of the Zhu family guarding the empire from rebellion, invasion, and internal instability. It was a family turned into a defense system. The logic was simple. If the empire faced threats, imperial princes would respond. If ministers grew too powerful, the emperor could rely on his own blood. If rebellion emerged, the dynasty would not depend solely on distant armies or uncertain officials. It would have its own internal force, loyal by birth, bound by lineage, and invested in the survival of the family itself. But this solution carried a hidden danger. Power shared within a family is still power divided. Each prince governed his domain with resources, troops, and influence. Each developed his own court, his own advisors, his own sense of authority. While they were expected to remain loyal to the emperor, they were also being trained, intentionally or not, in the exercise of power, and power, once experienced, rarely remains passive. Hongwu believed blood would ensure loyalty, but blood also creates rivalry. Brothers compare, sons measure themselves against fathers. Ambitious men do not always accept limits, even when those limits are written into the structure of the state. The very system designed to protect the dynasty from external threats began to introduce internal tension, because the question was no longer whether the Ming would survive Hongwu's death. The question was who within the Ming family would control what he left behind. And beneath the surface of this carefully constructed system, a silent conflict was already forming between central authority and princely power, between the throne and those who stood just close enough to imagine taking it. For now, Hongwu remained in control. His authority was unquestioned. His presence held the structure together. The princes served, the officials obeyed, and the empire functioned under the weight of his will. But systems built on one man's dominance are always fragile, because eventually that man is gone. And when Hongwu died, the Ming Dynasty would face its first true test, not from rebels, not from foreign armies, but from within its own bloodline, a test that would turn loyalty into suspicion and family into battlefield. The first crack in the Ming bloodline appeared the moment the founder was gone. Hongwu had ruled like a mountain, severe, immovable, impossible to ignore. While he lived, the system he created could survive its own contradictions, because everything depended on him. Officials feared him. Princes obeyed him. The court revolved around him. But death removed the one force holding the dynasty together. The throne passed not to one of Hongwu's powerful surviving sons, but to his grandson, the Jianwen Emperor. On paper, the succession was legitimate. In practice, it was dangerous. Jianwen inherited the title of emperor, but not the founder's aura. He inherited the palace, the rituals, and the mandate of heaven, but he also inherited uncles with armies, territories, and long memories. The young emperor understood the threat. Hongwu's princes were supposed to protect the dynasty. Instead, they now looked like rival centers of power. They were members of the imperial family, but that made them more dangerous, not less. Their blood gave them legitimacy. Their territories gave them resources. Their soldiers gave them leverage. So Jianwen and his advisors moved to reduce princely power. It was a rational policy. It was also a provocation. One by one, imperial princes were investigated, demoted, pressured, or stripped of authority. The central court wanted to secure the throne before the throne became a prize. But to the princes, this looked less like reform and more like survival politics. If one prince could be removed, any prince could be next. And among them stood Zhu Di, Prince of Yan. He was not a weak provincial noble waiting to be erased. He was experienced, militarized, based in the north, and shaped by frontier command. He had defended the empire. He had tasted authority. And now he watched a young nephew, guided by civil officials, attempt to dismantle the very system Hongwu had built. The conflict was no longer theoretical. It was personal. Jianwen claimed to be protecting the dynasty from overmighty relatives. Zhu Di claimed to be protecting the dynasty from corrupt ministers manipulating an inexperienced emperor. Both sides spoke the language of loyalty. Both claimed to defend the founder's legacy. But only one could control the throne. This is where Ming history turns inward. The dynasty that had risen from rebellion against the Yuan now faced rebellion from inside its own family. The danger Hongwu feared most had arrived with brutal irony, not because his family lacked power, but because he had given it too much. And Zhu Di was about to prove that in an empire built by force, legitimacy could be rewritten by victory. The family dispute was about to become a civil war. The war that would decide the future of the Ming dynasty did not begin as a war for power. It began as a war over legitimacy. In 1399, Zhu Di, Prince of Yan, rose in rebellion against his nephew, the Jianwen Emperor. Officially, he claimed he was not rebelling against the throne itself, but against the officials who surrounded it. He framed his campaign as a mission to clear the court of corrupt ministers, men he accused of misleading the young emperor and destabilizing the dynasty. It was a familiar strategy. In a system where loyalty to the throne defined legitimacy, few rebels declared themselves traitors. They declared themselves protectors. Zhu Di did the same. He presented himself not as a usurper, but as the true defender of his father's legacy, the founder who had built the Ming through strength, discipline, and suspicion of overreaching officials. But beneath the language of loyalty, the reality was simpler. This was a bid for the throne. The conflict that followed was brutal, prolonged, and deeply symbolic. It was not just a military struggle between armies. It was a test of whether the Ming dynasty would be ruled by central authority or by the strongest member of the imperial family. Zhu Di's advantage lay in experience. He had commanded troops along the northern frontier. He understood war not as theory, but as practice. His forces were hardened, organized, and loyal to him personally. By contrast, Jianwen relied heavily on court officials and generals, whose loyalty was tied more to the institution than to the man. The war moved in phases. At first, the imperial court underestimated Zhu Di. They saw him as a regional threat that could be contained. But Zhu Di did not fight like a cornered prince. He moved strategically, avoiding decisive defeat, building momentum, and exploiting the weaknesses of the central command. Cities fell. Alliances shifted. The conflict stretched on, draining resources and testing the resilience of the young emperor's regime. And then, in 1402, everything collapsed. Zhu Di's forces reached Nanjing, the imperial capital. The city fell. The palace burned. And the Jianwen emperor disappeared. No body was definitively identified. No official account could fully explain what happened. Some claimed he died in the fire. Others believed he escaped, living in hiding for the rest of his life. The uncertainty became one of the dynasty's enduring mysteries, an unresolved question at the heart of Ming legitimacy. Because if the emperor had survived, then who exactly now sat on the throne? Zhu Di crowned himself as the Yongle Emperor, perpetual happiness. The name itself was a statement of intent. After civil war, after destruction, after the violent rewriting of succession, Yongle needed to project stability, continuity, and inevitability. He did not present his rule as a break from the past. He presented it as its rightful continuation. What power seized is not the same as power accepted. Yongle faced a problem no founder had ever faced in quite the same way. He had taken the throne from within the dynasty, not from an external enemy. He had defeated not a foreign ruler, but his own blood. His legitimacy would always carry the shadow of that act, so he moved quickly to reshape reality. Records were altered, narratives were controlled. Officials were compelled to accept the new order. Resistance was not tolerated. Loyalty was redefined, not as fidelity to the previous emperor, but as obedience to the current one. This was not just consolidation. It was reconstruction. Yongle understood that victory alone was not enough. He had to build something so grand, so undeniable, that his right to rule would feel unquestionable. Not because it was pure, but because it was overwhelming. And that ambition would lead him to create the most powerful symbol of Ming authority ever built. A city that would embody control, hierarchy, and imperial permanence. A city that would outlast the man who seized the throne to build it. The Forbidden City. But before it became a symbol of eternal empire, it began as something more personal. A monument to a ruler who had taken power and needed the world to believe he was always meant to have it. Yongle did not inherit a stable throne. He had taken it. And that meant everything he built afterward had to do more than function. It had to justify. The capital he inherited was Nanjing, the city his father had chosen, the seat of the founder's authority. It was where the Ming had first declared itself, where Hongwu had ruled, where the dynasty had taken shape. But for Yongle, Nanjing carried a problem that could not be ignored. It was not his city. It was the place where he had overthrown his nephew, the place where the palace had burned, the place where his legitimacy was most fragile, most contested, and most closely tied to the memory of rebellion. So Yongle made a decision that would reshape the geography of power in China. He moved the capital north, to Beijing. At first glance, the decision could be explained in practical terms. The northern frontier was a constant concern. Steppe powers still posed a threat. A capital closer to the frontier meant faster military response, stronger defense, tighter control over the regions that had historically challenged imperial authority. But strategy was only part of the story. Beijing was also Yongle's power base. As Prince of Yan, he had governed from the north. His military strength, his loyal forces, his networks of command, all had been rooted there. By moving the capital, he was not just strengthening the empire's defenses, he was placing the center of imperial power inside a landscape he already understood and controlled. This was not just relocation, it was repositioning. Yongle was rewriting the map of the dynasty in a way that made his rule feel natural, even inevitable. The farther the court moved from Nanjing, the weaker the memory of the civil war became. The closer it moved to Beijing, the more it aligned with Yongg's own history. But a capital is not just a location, it is a statement. And Yonggl intended Beijing to be more than a defensive city. He intended it to become the heart of a new imperial order, one that would eclipse the past, absorb the present, and project power into the future. Construction began on a scale few could comprehend. Laborers, craftsmen, engineers, and officials were mobilized across the empire. Materials were transported over vast distances, timber from southern forests, stone from quarries, bricks fired in endless numbers. Entire logistical networks were bent toward a single purpose, the creation of a capital that would embody imperial authority in physical form. This was not simply building, it was demonstration. The message was clear: the Ming Dynasty was not weakened by civil war. It was stronger, more organized, more absolute. But beneath that message lay a contradiction. The same ruler who projected confidence had seized power through force. The same emperor who spoke of continuity had broken the line of succession. The same state that claimed harmony was driven by a need to control its own narrative. Beijing would resolve that contradiction, not by explaining it, but by overwhelming it. Because if Yonggl could build a capital so vast, so ordered, so symbolically complete, then questions about how he took power would begin to fade. The present would replace the past. The visible would silence the uncertain. And at the center of that new capital he would construct something even more powerful than walls, armies, or laws. A palace that turned power into spectacle. A place where hierarchy was not just enforced, but performed. A place where the emperor would not simply rule, but appear untouchable. The Forbidden City. And once it was built, the Ming Dynasty would no longer just hold power, it would embody it. The Forbidden City was designed to make distance feel sacred. It did not invite people in, it kept them out. It did not present the emperor as a man with a family, fears, rivals, and a contested past. It presented him as the still center of the universe, hidden behind gates, guarded by ritual, elevated by architecture, and surrounded by silence. Everything about it was intentional. The walls rose high enough to separate imperial life from ordinary life. The moat turned the palace into an island of power. The gates controlled movement so carefully that access itself became a form of rank. To move deeper into the palace was not simply to walk forward. It was to pass through layers of authority. First came the city, then the imperial city, then the palace city, then the palace city, then the halls where the emperor appeared, then the inner court where almost no outsider could go. Power was measured by proximity. A common subject might never see the emperor at all. An official might wait years for a moment in his presence. A minister could rise high in government and still remain outside the most private circles of influence. And those who lived closest to the throne, eunuchs, attendants, consorts, relatives, cooled shaped decisions without ever appearing in the formal language of state. This was the genius of the palace. It made politics physical. The Forbidden City turned hierarchy into space. It taught everyone who entered it where they stood. The vast courtyards made the individual feel small. The ceremonial halls elevated the throne above the human world. The straight central axis suggested order, certainty, and cosmic alignment. The emperor did not merely sit inside the palace. The palace made him appear as if he belonged at the center of creation. And for Yonggl this mattered deeply, because his power had not been clean. He had taken the throne through war. He had defeated his nephew. He had inherited a dynasty shadowed by unanswered questions. But inside the Forbidden City, those questions could be buried beneath ceremony. Every procession, every audience, every gate, every kneeling official repeated the same message. The emperor was legitimate because the world had been arranged around him. Architecture became propaganda. Beauty became control. The palace was magnificent, but it was not gentle. Its symmetry suggested harmony, yet its purpose was exclusion. Its golden roofs dazzled the eye, yet its walls concealed rivalry, fear, and confinement. It was a masterpiece of imperial imagination, and a reminder that absolute power often hides behind perfect order. For the Zhu family, the Forbidden City became both fortress and theater. It protected them from the world, but also separated them from it. It magnified their authority, but also trapped them inside the rituals that made that authority believable. The emperor was the most powerful man in the empire, yet even he lived inside a system designed to turn his every movement into performance. This was the paradox at the heart of Ming rule. The dynasty wanted power to appear natural, but it needed endless ceremony to make it seem that way. It wanted the emperor to appear untouchable. But the very need for walls revealed the fear underneath. It wanted the palace to symbolize order, but inside its chambers, the old dangers remained: ambition, jealousy, succession, secrecy, and betrayal. The Forbidden City could make power look eternal, it could not make it safe. And while Yongle was building inward, toward a sealed world of ritual and control, he was also looking outward, beyond the walls, beyond the capital, beyond China's coasts, because an emperor who had seized the throne needed more than a palace. He needed the world to recognize him. While the Forbidden City sealed power within walls, Yongle sought to project that power across oceans, because a ruler who had taken the throne by force needed recognition, not just from his own court, but from the world beyond it. So he turned to the sea. In the early 15th century, under Yongle's command, fleets unlike anything the world had seen began to leave China's southern ports. These were not small trading vessels or exploratory ships driven by private ambition. They were state-sponsored expeditions, massive, organized, deliberate, floating declarations of imperial authority. At their head stood Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch loyal to Yongle, shaped by the same palace system that produced power through proximity rather than birth. His position itself revealed something about the Ming system. Influence did not always follow traditional paths. In the inner court, those closest to the emperor could become instruments of his will in ways that bypassed the official bureaucracy. Zheng He's voyages were not about conquest in the way later European empires would understand it. They were about presence. The fleets carried silk, porcelain, and imperial edicts. They traveled across Southeast Asia, India, the Arabian Peninsula, and the eastern coast of Africa. They arrived in foreign ports not as merchants seeking opportunity, but as representatives of a civilization that considered itself the center of the world. This was diplomacy as spectacle. Foreign rulers were invited, sometimes compelled, to acknowledge the Ming emperor through tribute missions. Exotic goods returned to China, animals, spices, rare objects that reinforced the image of a world orbiting around the Ming court. The message was carefully constructed. China was stable, powerful, and ordered. Its emperor was legitimate, not just at home, but in the eyes of distant lands. For Yongle, this mattered. He had seized the throne internally. These voyages helped him secure something external: recognition that did not depend on the memory of civil war. The farther Ming ships traveled, the more they extended his version of reality. But there was a contradiction beneath the spectacle. The same empire that projected confidence across oceans remained deeply controlled at home. The same ruler who sent fleets thousands of miles outward maintained rigid hierarchies within his own borders. The same court that received tribute from foreign envoys tightly regulated its own population. Expansion and restriction existed side by side, and the voyages themselves were not permanent. They depended on imperial will, resources, and political priorities. They were not driven by private enterprise or long-term colonization. They were expressions of a particular moment, a moment when the Ming Dynasty under Yongle chose to show the world its reach. When that moment passed, the fleets would not continue indefinitely, which raises an uncomfortable question. If the Ming had the capability to project power across oceans, why did it not sustain that path? Why did a dynasty capable of building the Forbidden City and commanding vast fleets ultimately turn inward again? The answer lies not just in policy, but in priorities. Because even at the height of its outward reach, the Ming dynasty remained focused on something closer, more fragile, and more dangerous than distant seas: control at home. And as Yongle's reign demonstrated, maintaining that control would require not just spectacle, but force. The Ming dynasty under Yongle dazzled the world, but it was built on force. Behind the golden roofs of the Forbidden City, behind the vast fleets crossing the Indian Ocean, behind the rituals that projected harmony and order, there was a harsher reality, one that made all of it possible. Power at this scale is never gentle. The construction of Beijing and the Forbidden City demanded enormous labor. Workers were mobilized from across the empire. Materials were hauled over long distances, often at great human cost. Timber, stone, bricks, each piece of the imperial vision required effort, measured not just in resources, but in lives, exhaustion, and suffering. The palace stood as a symbol of perfection. But perfection required sacrifice. Yongel's rule also extended through military force. Campaigns were launched against threats along the northern frontier. The emperor did not simply defend the empire. He sought to dominate its borders, to ensure that no external force could challenge the authority he had fought so hard to secure. These campaigns reinforced Ming's strength, but they also consumed resources and lives, binding the dynasty's stability to continued exertion. And then there was the violence closer to the throne. Yongle had taken power through civil war. He understood that legitimacy built on victory could always be questioned. So he moved to silence doubt. Officials who resisted, scholars who refused to accept his version of events, and those suspected of loyalty to the previous emperor faced consequences that ranged from dismissal to execution. Records were rewritten. Dissent was dangerous. The narrative of the dynasty was not allowed to fracture. This was not unique to Yongle. It was part of a larger pattern within the Ming system, a belief that control over information, loyalty, and perception was as important as control over land and armies. But under Yongle, this instinct was sharpened by the circumstances of his rise. He did not inherit uncontested legitimacy. He enforced it, and that enforcement came with a cost that cannot be ignored. This is the contrast at the heart of Yongle's reign. On one side, a ruler of extraordinary ambition, who built a capital that still defines imperial China, who projected power across oceans, who expanded the reach and confidence of the Ming Dynasty. On the other, a ruler who relied on coercion, suppression, and relentless control to secure his position, whose achievements were inseparable from the violence that sustained them. The glory was real, so was the fear, and that duality would define the Ming Dynasty long after Yongle's death. The empire he shaped would continue to function, to expand, to produce culture, wealth, and influence. But it would also carry forward the habits he reinforced: centralization, suspicion, control, and the constant need to protect the image of power. Because once a dynasty builds itself on both spectacle and force, it cannot easily abandon either. The Forbidden City would continue to stage authority. The state would continue to enforce it. And as the Ming system matured, new actors would emerge inside that structure, figures who did not wear crowns, but who could influence emperors, shape decisions, and quietly redirect power from behind the walls. To understand how the dynasty truly functioned, we have to move beyond the emperor alone, into the machinery that kept the empire running. The Ming dynasty was not held together by emperors alone. No single man, however feared, could govern an empire of such scale by personal command. Behind the throne stood a vast machinery of paperwork, ritual, education, punishment, and ambition. It was less dramatic than rebellion, less visible than the Forbidden City, but in many ways it was the true skeleton of Ming power. This was the world of the scholar official. These men were not born with crowns, but they could rise through learning. The civil service examinations promised a path from study to influence, from provincial classrooms to imperial administration. In theory, it was a system of merit. A man who mastered the classics, language, ethics, and statecraft could enter government and serve the dynasty. It was one of the Ming's greatest strengths. It was also one of its great illusions, because merit did not erase hierarchy. Education required time, tutors, books, and family support. The sons of established households had advantages the poor could rarely overcome. The system rewarded intelligence, but it also reproduced status. It offered the image of moral government while binding ambitious men to the throne. This was power through aspiration. Across the empire, magistrates collected taxes, judged disputes, maintained records, organized labor, and reported upward. Ministries in the capital handled war, revenue, rights, justice, personnel, and public works. Memorials flowed toward the emperor, carrying information from distant provinces into the heart of the state. Orders flowed back down, turning imperial will into local reality. The dynasty ruled through ink as much as armies, but paperwork could also become a battlefield. Officials competed for influence. Moral language could conceal factional rivalry. A memorial presented as loyal advice could be read as criticism. A policy debate could become a test of obedience. The scholar official class claimed to defend Confucian virtue, but it also fought constantly over access, reputation, and survival. Here was the Ming contradiction again. The empire needed educated men to function, but it feared letting them become too powerful. The emperor needed advice, but advice could sound like defiance. Officials were expected to serve truth, yet punished if truth offended the throne. So Ming government became a delicate performance. The emperor appeared supreme. The officials appeared loyal. The bureaucracy appeared moral. But underneath, everyone understood the danger. A careless phrase could ruin a career. A factional enemy could destroy a family. A ruler's anger could turn service into catastrophe. Still, the machine endured. It endured because it gave the dynasty reach. It allowed the Zhu family to govern villages they would never see, tax fields they would never walk, and command people who would never enter the palace gates. It turned imperial authority into daily administration. But there was a problem hidden inside this system. The official bureaucracy was powerful, educated, and public. Yet, some of the most dangerous influence in the Ming court came from people who stood outside it entirely. And to see that shadow government, we have to move deeper into the palace. The most powerful men in the Ming dynasty did not always hold official titles. Some of them could not even have families. Inside the Forbidden City, beyond the reach of formal bureaucracy, another system of influence was growing, quieter, more intimate, and often more dangerous than the public machinery of government. It was built around proximity, not rank. Access, not examination. Loyalty, not philosophy. This was the world of the eunuchs. Eunuchs were servants of the inner court, men who had been physically altered to serve within the imperial household. They could not pass their position to sons. They had no legitimate bloodline to extend. In theory, this made them ideal servants, dependent entirely on the emperor, with no external loyalties. In practice, it made them something else. Because in a system where access to the emperor meant influence over the empire, the men who stood closest to him could shape decisions in ways no distant official ever could. Scholar officials governed through documents, eunuchs governed through presence. They carried messages. They controlled audiences. They managed information flowing into and out of the palace. They could observe the emperor's moods, anticipate his reactions, and influence what he saw, heard, and trusted. They were not bound by the same moral expectations as Confucian officials. They did not need to debate policy in open court. Their power was quieter, and therefore harder to challenge. This created a rivalry at the heart of the Ming state. On one side stood the scholar officials, educated public, bound to ideals of moral governance. On the other stood the eunuchs, private, flexible, tied directly to the emperor's personal authority. Each distrusted the other. Each claimed to serve the throne more faithfully. The emperor, in many ways, relied on both, but that balance was unstable. As emperors withdrew deeper into palace life, or simply lost interest in constant governance, the role of eunuchs expanded. Some were tasked with special missions. Others became administrators of imperial workshops, intelligence networks, or palace finances. Over time, eunuch institutions developed their own internal hierarchies and loyalties, and in certain periods, they became instruments of surveillance. Secret investigations, internal monitoring, the quiet gathering of information, these activities blurred the line between service and control. The state that already depended on registration and law now extended its reach through people who operated outside the formal system. To officials, this was deeply threatening. It meant that power could bypass the structures they had trained their entire lives to enter. It meant that influence could be gained not through examination or merit, but through favor. It meant that criticism of policy might be reported not through open channels, but through private whispers. This is where the Ming system reveals one of its most unsettling truths. The more centralized power became, the more it depended on personal access. And the more it depended on personal access, the more it created space for hidden influence. The court presented itself as ordered, rational, and hierarchical. But behind that image was a second layer, fluid, opaque, and shaped by relationships no examination system could regulate. The eunuchs were not simply servants. They were part of the dynasty's nervous system. They carried signals, filtered information, and sometimes redirected the flow of power itself. And in a court already shaped by suspicion, rivalry, and the legacy of purges, that kind of influence could become explosive, because when power is hidden, it becomes harder to trust. And when trust disappears, even a system as vast as the Ming Dynasty begins to turn inward against itself. But the struggle for influence inside the palace was not limited to officials and eunuchs. There was another group, equally close to the emperor, equally restricted, and equally capable of shaping the future of the dynasty. They did not sit in councils, they did not command armies, but they lived closer to the throne than anyone else, and their world was one of both privilege and confinement. The women of the Ming Palace lived at the center of power and at the edge of imprisonment. They were surrounded by silk, ritual, servants, music, ceremony, and guarded halls. Their world appeared luxurious from the outside, almost impossible for ordinary people to imagine. But luxury inside the Forbidden City did not mean freedom. It often meant being watched, ranked, moved, chosen, ignored, or remembered only because of the son one produced. The imperial household was not merely private life, it was dynastic infrastructure. Empresses, consorts, concubines, dowagers, and palace women all existed within a system designed to protect the bloodline. Their bodies, marriages, pregnancies, alliances, and reputations mattered because succession mattered. A son born to the right woman at the right moment could alter the future of the empire. A mother of an heir could become politically important overnight. A dowager empress, if she survived long enough, could become a force behind the throne. This was influence without freedom. The Ming state spoke the language of Confucian hierarchy. Men ruled publicly. Women were expected to embody virtue, obedience, and family continuity. But inside dynastic politics, the private and public worlds could never be separated. The emperor's household was also the future of the state. A bedroom could matter as much as a battlefield. A birth could matter as much as a decree, yet the price was confinement. Palace women lived behind walls built to protect imperial purity and prevent scandal. Their movements were restricted. Their status depended on favor, fertility, family background, and court politics. They could rise, but they could also disappear into silence. The same system that placed them near the source of imperial power also denied them open political identity. This was the paradox of the inner court. A woman could shape the dynasty through motherhood, counsel, patronage, or survival, but she could rarely be seen as an official actor. Her influence had to move through relationship, ritual, and proximity. Like the eunuchs, palace women existed inside the unofficial channels of power. Unlike eunuchs, their importance was tied directly to blood, and blood was the dynasty's obsession. The Zhu family had built an empire, but every generation depended on reproduction, inheritance, and legitimacy. The court could produce laws, armies, and monuments, but without a recognized heir, everything trembled. The imperial women therefore carried a burden the public bureaucracy could not carry. They preserved the future of the ruling house, but they also suffered under it. Behind the golden roofs were rivalries, loneliness, fear, and calculation. Favor could become survival. Motherhood could become protection. Jealousy could become dangerous. A woman elevated by the emperor's attention might gain status, but also enemies. A woman ignored could spend her life inside splendor that felt like exile. The Forbidden City magnified this contradiction. It made the emperor's family sacred, but also captive. It protected the bloodline by enclosing it. It honored women as mothers of dynasty while reducing them to instruments of succession. It created a world where private emotion was never truly private, because every intimate relationship could carry political consequence. This is why the history of the Ming cannot be told only through emperors, ministers, and armies. The dynasty was also made in hidden rooms, in births and deaths, in whispered rivalries, in mothers protecting sons. in women navigating a system that gave them proximity to absolute power while denying them the freedom to openly possess it. Their story reveals the human cost of dynastic rule. Because empire does not only control territory, it controls families, it controls bodies, it controls memory, and beyond the palace walls, another force was beginning to test the Ming vision of control, one that could not be confined by ritual, rank, or locked gates, money. The Ming Dynasty wanted an empire rooted in the soil, but wealth had other plans. From the very beginning, Hongwu had imagined a world of farmers, villages, and stable agricultural life. In his vision, land meant order, and commerce meant risk. Merchants moved, prices shifted. Wealth could concentrate in unpredictable ways. Trade created connections the state could not always control. But as the Ming Dynasty matured, reality began to diverge from the founder's dream. China did not remain still. Markets expanded, cities grew, trade routes multiplied. Craftsmen produced goods not just for local use, but for distant buyers. Silk, porcelain, lacquerware. These were not just symbols of culture, they were commodities moving through networks that connected the Ming world to regions far beyond its borders. And at the center of this transformation was silver. Silver became the lifeblood of the Ming economy. Taxes, which had once been tied to grain and labor, increasingly shifted toward payment in silver. This simplified administration, but it also changed the nature of the economy itself. Villagers who had once paid in crops now needed access to currency. Farmers became participants in markets whether they intended to or not. This created opportunity. It also created dependence, because much of that silver did not originate within China. It flowed in from abroad, through trade with Japan, and later through global networks that would connect Ming China to Spanish-controlled mines in the Americas. Silver crossed oceans, passed through merchants' hands, and entered the empire as the medium through which obligations could be met and wealth could be stored. This was a quiet revolution. The Ming Dynasty, which had been built on the ideal of agrarian stability, was now tied into a global economic system. Its internal order depended, in part, on forces beyond its control: foreign mines, maritime trade, fluctuating supply. And yet the official ideology did not fully change. The state still spoke the language of agriculture, hierarchy, and moral governance. It still viewed merchants with suspicion. It still tried to regulate trade, to limit its excesses, to prevent instability. But the economy had already moved forward. Wealth accumulated in new ways. Merchant families gained influence. Urban centers became more dynamic. The gap between ideal and reality widened. On paper, the Ming Empire remained agrarian and controlled. In practice, it was increasingly commercial and interconnected. This contradiction mattered because it introduced a new kind of power into the system, one that did not depend on imperial rank or proximity to the throne. Wealth could shape decisions. It could fund networks. It could influence local officials. It could create loyalties that did not flow directly upward to the emperor. Money, unlike ritual, was difficult to contain. And when the flow of silver was strong, the system adapted, trade expanded, taxes were paid, the machine continued to function. But when that flow weakened, when supply tightened, when prices shifted, when access became uncertain, the entire structure began to strain. What had once been a strength became a vulnerability. The Ming Dynasty had built a powerful state. It had created systems of control, administration, and ritual that reached across vast territories. But it had also, almost unintentionally, tied its stability to a global economy it did not fully command. This is the deeper contrast. An empire that sought control found itself dependent. A dynasty that feared instability became linked to forces beyond its borders. And as long as the balance held, the contradiction remained hidden. But it would not remain hidden forever, because the same wealth that strengthened the Ming would eventually expose its weaknesses and feed into the tensions that would bring the empire toward crisis. The Ming Dynasty did not only rule through power, it ruled through beauty. Long after armies moved and emperors died, what remained, what people remembered, was not always the fear, the purges, or the political machinery. It was porcelain that seemed impossibly delicate, paintings that captured entire worlds in ink, architecture that felt aligned with the heavens, books, stories, and symbols that carried the dynasty's image far beyond its own lifetime. This was the Ming cultural halo, a glow that still surrounds the dynasty centuries after its fall. Under Ming rule, art and culture did not simply flourish, they were curated. The court encouraged a return to classical forms, to earlier ideals, to a sense of refinement that suggested continuity with a deeper Chinese past. This was not accidental. After overthrowing a foreign dynasty, the Ming needed to present itself as authentic, rooted, legitimate. Culture became evidence. Porcelain, especially, became a global symbol of Ming prestige. Blue and white ceramics traveled across continents, admired for their precision, their balance, their near-perfect craftsmanship. They carried with them an image of a civilization that was ordered, skilled, and refined. To foreign observers, these objects represented a kind of perfection. But they were also products of control. Imperial workshops operated under strict supervision. Production was organized, standardized, and often tied to state demand. The beauty of Ming objects did not emerge from pure artistic freedom. It emerged from a system that directed labor, enforced quality, and shaped output according to imperial expectations. The same was true of literature and scholarship. Printing expanded, books circulated more widely. Stories, histories, and philosophical works reached new audiences. The Ming period saw the growth of novels and narratives that would later become classics. On the surface, this suggested intellectual vitality, a society rich in ideas and expression, and in many ways it was. But even here, there were boundaries. The state could tolerate creativity, but not dissent that threatened order. Writers navigated expectations. Scholars balanced moral expression with political caution. Culture flourished, but it did so within an environment shaped by authority. This is the dual nature of the Ming cultural legacy. It was brilliant, and it was managed. The dynasty presented itself as a guardian of civilization, a restorer of tradition after foreign rule, a patron of art, a cultivator of beauty, and this image proved powerful. It outlasted the political system itself. It shaped how later generations remembered the Ming, not only as rulers, but as creators. But cultural brilliance can obscure what sustains it. The porcelain does not show the labor behind it. The architecture does not reveal the exhaustion that built it. The literature does not always speak openly about the risks of speaking too freely. The halo glows because it simplifies. It turns a complex, often harsh system into something elegant, almost timeless. It invites admiration, sometimes without interrogation. And that is why the Ming dynasty remains so compelling, because the image it left behind is so strong that it invites belief. Belief in a golden age, belief in harmony, belief in a restored, perfected China. But belief is not the same as reality. And to understand the Ming fully, we have to step beyond the beauty and begin to question the stories that have been built around it. The first myth is one of the most persistent, that Ming China turned its back on the world. It is a powerful image, an empire behind walls, a court suspicious of outsiders, ships left to rot, harbors silenced, a civilization choosing isolation over engagement. But like many powerful images, it is only partly true. The Ming dynasty was not defined by isolation. It was defined by control, because at the very moment this image suggests withdrawal, the historical reality reveals something far more complex. The same dynasty that would later restrict maritime activity once commanded one of the most ambitious naval programs in the world. Under the Yongle Emperor, fleets did not retreat from the sea. They dominated it. Massive treasure ships, far larger than anything seen in contemporary Europe, crossed the Indian Ocean under the command of Zheng He. These voyages were not accidents. They were state-directed demonstrations of power. They carried silk, porcelain, and imperial authority to distant courts. They returned with tribute, exotic goods, and recognition of Ming supremacy. This was not isolation. It was projection, but projection came with limits. The Ming court did not embrace open trade in the modern sense. It did not allow private expansion to operate freely. Instead, it framed foreign interaction through a controlled system. Trade was structured as tribute. Diplomacy was ritualized. Foreign powers were expected to acknowledge the emperor's central position in the world. This created a contradiction. The empire reached outward, but only on its own terms. It welcomed connection, but only when that connection reinforced hierarchy. And when the court began to see maritime activity as a source of instability, that openness narrowed. Restrictions increased. Private trade was limited or pushed into unofficial channels. Coastal defenses tightened. The state did not abandon the sea entirely, but it redefined its relationship with it. This is where the myth begins to take shape. Over time, selective control became remembered as total closure. Policy shifts became simplified into a single narrative, that Ming China turned inward and refused the world. But the truth is more uncomfortable. The Ming Dynasty did not reject the outside world. It feared losing control to it. Because openness brings unpredictability. Trade creates wealth, but also independence. Contact spreads ideas, influence, and pressures that no court can fully regulate. And for a dynasty built on order, hierarchy, and central authority, that risk was always present. So the question was never simply whether to open or close. It was how much control the empire was willing to surrender. And that brings us to a deeper myth, one that is even more appealing and even more misleading. That the Ming Dynasty was not only powerful, but fundamentally just. The second myth is more comforting. That the Ming Dynasty was not only powerful, but righteous. That it restored China after foreign rule and governed with justice, stability, and moral clarity. And in part, this belief has a foundation. The Ming did overthrow the Yuan dynasty. It did present itself as a return to native rule, to familiar traditions, to a political order rooted in Confucian ideals. It rebuilt institutions, reasserted hierarchy, and promoted an image of moral governance. To many, it looked like restoration, but restoration is not the same as benevolence. Because behind the language of virtue, the Ming state was built on control, and control required force. From its very beginning, the dynasty carried the memory of chaos, famine, rebellion, war. The founder himself had lived through it, and that experience shaped the system he created. Order would not be left to chance. It would be enforced. Land was registered, populations were counted. Movement was tracked, officials were watched, laws were detailed and severe. The empire was made legible to the throne, not for convenience, but for command. And when that command was threatened, the response was not always measured. It was decisive. Purges became part of governance. Suspicion became part of leadership. Entire networks of officials could fall under accusation. Loyalty was expected, but it was never fully trusted. This was not unique to the Ming, but it was central to how the dynasty functioned. Even the systems that appeared just carried a second edge. The bureaucracy rewarded learning, but it also demanded conformity. Officials were expected to uphold moral standards, but within boundaries that protected imperial authority. Expression was possible, but dissent carried risk. Justice existed, but it operated within limits defined by power, and beyond the court the reality was even more complex. Peasants worked land that was carefully regulated. Taxes were collected with precision. In times of stability, this created order. In times of stress, it created pressure. Labor could be mobilized on a massive scale. Projects that symbolized imperial greatness, walls, palaces, infrastructure, were built through human effort that was rarely voluntary. The state provided structure, but it also demanded sacrifice. This is the tension at the heart of the Ming myth. A dynasty that presented itself as a restorer of harmony, while relying on systems that controlled, disciplined, and at times punished the very society it governed. To call it purely benevolent is to ignore that tension. To call it purely oppressive is to miss its achievements. The truth sits in between. The Ming restored a vision of order, but it did so by shaping society to fit that vision. And once that image took hold, it became something more than policy. It became memory, which raises a deeper question. If the reality was so complex, why does the simpler story endure? If the reality was so complex, why does the simpler story endure? Because myths are easier to remember than contradictions. The Ming Dynasty left behind something more powerful than records or policies. It left behind an image of order, refinement, and cultural brilliance, one that feels complete, even when the history behind it is not. And that image was carefully built. The dynasty understood the importance of perception. It did not only rule through administration or force, it ruled through symbols, through rituals that suggested harmony, through architecture that implied permanence, through culture that signaled continuity with a deeper past. Over time, these signals became memory. Later generations did not experience the full machinery of Ming governance. They did not feel the weight of its laws, or the pressure of its surveillance, or the fear that could exist inside its political system. What they inherited instead were its artifacts, porcelain that survived centuries, palaces that still stand, books that continued to circulate, stories that were copied, retold, and reshaped. These are easier to preserve than systems of control. And so, the balance shifts, the harsh edges fade, the visible achievements remain. What was once a lived experience becomes a curated legacy. But there is another reason these myths persist. They serve a need. The idea of a restored, harmonious China after a period of foreign rule is compelling. It offers a narrative of resilience, of identity reclaimed, of civilization continuing even after disruption. That narrative carries weight far beyond the Ming itself. It becomes a reference point, a symbol, something later generations can look back to when asking what stability, order, or cultural strength might look like. But symbols simplify. They compress complexity into something that can be understood quickly, remembered easily, and repeated without friction. And in doing so, they remove tension. The Ming Dynasty becomes a golden age, a moment of balance, a period where power and virtue appear aligned. Yet the closer we look, the more that alignment begins to fracture, because the same system that produced beauty also produced control. The same state that preserved tradition also enforced limits. The same dynasty that projected harmony also managed fear. None of these realities cancel each other out. They coexist. And that is what makes the Ming so difficult to reduce to a single story. Its legacy is not one of pure brilliance or pure oppression. It is a system that achieved extraordinary things while relying on structures that shaped, constrained, and at times burdened the society beneath it. But that kind of truth is harder to hold. It requires attention. It demands nuance. It resists easy conclusions. Myths, on the other hand, offer clarity. And clarity is powerful. It allows the past to feel settled, even when it is not, which brings us to the final phase of the Ming story. Because myths can shape how a dynasty is remembered, but they cannot prevent how it ends. The decline of the Ming Dynasty did not begin with invasion. It began